of you know, since 1961, nonprofit MSI has been the bridge between marketing theory and business practice. We fund research by leading academics worldwide on topics voted by our 70-plus corporate sponsors and disseminate results through members-only events and a variety of publications. I'm very pleased to welcome you to another MSI For Members by Members webinar. This is a series of webinars on subjects related to MSI's current research priority topics. First, I'd like to point out the Q&A module on your screen. Please use this feature to send through any questions you have for Leslie during the presentation. We'll gather the questions at the end and have a brief Q&A session following the presentation. If you send through a question for Leslie during the webinar, please be sure to send the question to MSI Meeting. Also, Leslie's slides, as well as the entire webinar, will be available for viewing and download on the MSI member website. So with that, I'd like to introduce you today to today's featured speaker, Leslie Wood of Nielsen Catalina Solutions, has kindly agreed to present today's webinar on long-term ad effectiveness measurement. As many of you probably know, Leslie is a pioneer and innovator in advertising analytics and has more than 25 years of experience. She is currently the Chief Research Officer responsible for research and development at Nielsen Catalina Solutions, and her work includes shaping methodologies that keep the firm on the leading edge of marketing and advertising performance, analytics, playing a key role in envisioning future products. Leslie has a long history and deep involvement with single-source methodologies, including Behavior Scan, Scan America, and Project Apollo. And I will add to her bio that she was recently given the President's Award by the Advertising Research Foundation, which is a very prestigious award, and received a well-deserved tribute from her colleagues in the media measurement community. So Leslie is an expert not only in single-source analytics, but reach and frequency research, optimizers, data integration, return path data. So as you can see, very well qualified to share with us the latest thinking and findings about long-term impact of advertising. Leslie is Treasurer of the Market Research Council, Secretary of the Advertising Research Council, and Nielsen's liaison to the Center for Research Excellence ROI Committee. She has a BS in Mathematics from Hunter College and a PhD from the University of Albany in Information Science, specializing in expert systems and data mining. So we're very pleased to have Leslie and the webinar today. Leslie?
Hi, everybody. Oh, good. I can see that the words are coming out. Welcome. So this is this presentation is going to share with you phase 2 of a body of work on long-term advertising effectiveness. Advertising is designed to build a connection between the consumer and the brand. The idea is that the ad generates that connection between between how the consumer thinks about themselves and how that brand integrates with that concept. So the first step is to get consideration. The second step piece of that is to actually activate, to have a short-term sales, to actually produce an increase in the purchasing of that brand short-term, and then with that connection and that connected piece of loyalty comes long-term effects. So everybody on this webinar, everybody that we know, has considered how do they spend money and how do you spend money over time? How do you spend your money to drive the highest effect of advertising, the highest effect of whatever you are doing? So we think about building that connection, having advertising create that connection with the consumer. That's what really fine advertising does. Okay. So when we measure short-term effects, we report on what kind of buyers are we delivering. We think about penetration. We think about repeat buyers, new buyers. We look amongst the existing buyers. Did they increase their purchase amount? Did they make more trips? We call that buying rate. We look at the basket size. How many items are in each basket, and how often do they go? And altogether, that information gives us the short-term effects, and that's part of what we call sales effect. But there's a deeper piece. There's a piece of understanding trial and repeat and looking at the short term and the long term. So when we look at the long term, very often advertisers say, well, my goal is to drive trial, or my goal is to drive more sales among existing buyers. And the key here, one of the things we've been thinking about quite a bit, is there's been an enormous focus on trial in the last year, and actually that isn't focusing on the consumer. We've been saying consumer is king. We've been saying put the consumer in the center. I mean, that's been the mantra for at least the last 5 years, if not 10. And when we think about putting the consumer in the center, our consumer is our repeat purchaser. So when we were looking at how do we measure brand equity, we wanted to not only measure the value of driving trial, but we wanted to measure something about what's the equity of the brand, what's the loyalty of the brand, what is the connectedness of the brand to the consumers that actually buy the brand against the existing buyers, and look at that repeat. And that was really the main result of phase one, was building this measure called trial and depth of repeat, and identifying it as a key discriminator in what produces the largest future purchasing, post-advertising period purchasing among households. So we looked at this, and the way we count trial and depth of repeat is we go for roughly a year, and we say we collect all the purchases in the category, and then after that year we can now say with certainty, is this household a trier, or have they ever bought the brand in the last year or not? And the first time they buy the brand, we call them a T, a trier, and we can see this is the first time they've bought the brand. The next time they go shopping for the category, we say, did they buy the brand or not? In this case, you can see they go from a T to a 2. It's the second time they bought the brand. And then the next time they go to the store, they didn't buy the brand. Now, this is different days. This is different. It can be weeks. It can be days. In our case, it's days across periods of time within weeks. And what you see is that what we're really kind of counting is how well is the brand doing as a winning streak for each of these within this household? It's how many times is it winning in a row? It goes back to 0 every time the brand is not bought on a particular category purchase occasion. The other thing we did in phase one, we said we'll stop at 6. We saw that there were many kinds of brands where you'd see somebody bought it for the 187th time or the 112th time, and you have this extremely long tail of, many high levels of purchases. So we cut it off at 6 and said anything at 6 we're gonna call a 6. At 6 and above, it's a 6 plus. Actually, 6 plus is an artifact, and we've now extended that to as long as we can measure. So this is the key concept of trial and depth of repeat. And what do we see when we look at trial and depth of repeat? We see how many more purchases are made in the future among the people who tried the brand. So we've got salty snacks. And we see not a lot of, if we take people who bought the brand during the advertising and how many purchases did they make out in the future year, for every dollar they made, how many did they make in the future year? It was 10 cents. And we look at what happens across this trial and depth of repeat measure. So at the low end, we see for every dollar, $1.50. And usually what we see is this first 1, 2, or 3, we see a drop, and then we see a steady increase across higher depths of repeat. So as a household buys the brand over and over and over again, the likelihood of them buying the brand, spending more money on that brand in the next 52 weeks increases. That's really great, but what you see also is these yellow dots, this is the number of households there are. So there's a lot of households who are in trial, and even more that are left, they're zeros turning into ones. So these are households that did not buy the brand. The last time they went to the store, advertising came along and they bought the brand. So these are heavy. The far left is much more switchers, and the bulk of the households are on the left side of this chart. So while the highest value to an advertiser is the far right, the bulk of households are on the left. It's important to see that, if you put them together, when you weight those pieces together, you get to a 1. And we weight average them based on how advertising drove each one of these pieces. So for salty snacks, we have a 1 because that's our short term. And then in this case, we saw an average of a 1. That's the long term. So the short term plus the long term gives us a 2. And what do we do with that 2? That 2 is a multiplier that we can multiply the short term by. So in this case, there was $14 cents lift per exposed household. The long term multiplier was a 2, and what they got was 28 cents per exposed household. So the net effect of all the advertising, short and long together, was twice as large as the short term. It's a very common example. We also did this for Special K, and this is from Special K. You can see again trial producing not as high results out into the next year, but you see much higher levels for switchers. So here, the 1, 2s, and 3s, it's a diminishing, and then we were unable to read Special K further out than 6 because the samples get too small, but the numbers go out. It's a very, very long tail. So each little piece is very tiny. We put them all together, and the net effect, each of those pieces weighted by the effect that short-term advertising, the amount of advertising that was driven to trial, and we get a 1.8. In the case of Special K, the short-term effect is 1. The long-term effect multiplier is 1.8. Put that together, and to get the total effect of advertising, the multiplier is 2.8. So another 14 cents per exposed household with a multiplier of 2.8 gives you a full advertising of 39 cents for every dollar spent. Why would you want to actually know this multiplier? The industry's known for a long time that the average multiplier should be 2. There's been many studies done that looked at this, and so the thumbnail, the rule of thumb is use a 2. But why would you want to actually know? Well, you'd want to know because you want to assess your marketing tactics and accurately and budget accordingly. So if you have that Special K with a 2.8, advertising is going to be a lot more valuable to you than if you are the advertiser with a number considerably lower than 2. And we do see quite a range, which I'll be sharing in a moment. You'd also want to do enough of these studies to understand what drives the highest long-term value. Is it the type of, is it the other marketing activities that you use? Is it something about the brand? Is it related to the category? What is it that drives the highest long-term value? We don't know. We're going to share some insights at the end of this presentation, but actually understanding what drives the long-term, that's why you'd want to measure. You also want to build a healthy brand, and we believe that the highest multipliers indicate much higher levels of loyalty and a healthier brand. So for phase 2, Dave Poltrak and I, at Dave Poltrak's recommendation, actually, he supported this work. We went out and we asked a group of experts across the industry and academia to help us with what we've done. And I shared the work I'd done in detail, and they came back with recommendations on ways to improve it and make it more salient to the industry. So the people we spoke to Jeff Dowd supported us extremely well across this entire endeavor by allowing us to use Special K as a key brand to do deep dives on. Neil Cantor at Nielsen went through every single piece of math deeply and actually had some very concrete recommendations, as did Ross. Bill Harvey made some valuable recommendations, which I'll talk about in a minute. He's a co-founder of TRA, and Byron Sharp, the Ehrenberg boss, made quite a few, and Jim Donius, and Mike Hansen. And Mike Hansen is worked with us through MASB, the Marketing and Accountability Standards Board. So altogether, we measured 23 brands, multiple ways, with 31 different studies. The kinds of insights and suggestions that group of panelists made, the first was that we need to do some form of validation, which I'll share. Second was that we should count, and this is a Neil Cantor recommendation that's complex and would take much more than an hour to describe, but you need to count and then remove the long-term pattern of non-buyers. So we're looking at triers, but we also need to look at people who didn't try. So we're looking at what's the value of having moved to a trial. We also were told we had looked at the effect of advertising across an entire year, but most of the advertising that wasn't during the campaign period tended to be make goods, very, very small dribs and drabs of advertising, and the numbers got considerably larger when we looked at only those periods when advertising was really strongly on air or in the market. In this case, we were looking at television, so it's on the air. We needed to look at what periods of time we were looking for short-term and long-term. We decided on short-term. We had been looking at 4 weeks, and then we extended it out to as long as we possibly could, which was 12 weeks, 12 to 13 weeks, which is the most you see in short-term when you're looking at single-source data. We were dinged for only looking at the indirect or residual effects, and that was because we were looking at 4 weeks. So by extending it to as long as we could measure, we had many more of the direct effects of advertising. Bill Harvey suggested it not be black box, that deciding on a 6 as the number to aggregate above, or using 28 days, that we should really use as few assumptions as possible and let the data decide, which we did. It was suggested that we measure other media beyond TV, and definitely we completely agree, and this we will be doing in the future. We were also told to be more explicit about how representative the sample is and the statics that are used. And in any paper about this work and any study that we do, we're very specific about what the statics are in the sample. Byron Sharp also called out that we really have to recognize that we're only measured media. So non-measured media are not included. My first reaction was, well, I'm pretty proud of that. We're not estimating things we don't have data for. But on the other hand, we also have to recognize as researchers that there are an awful lot more touch points and things that influence people's behavior beyond those things that are actually in our data. And that needs to be, we have to consider that and include it in our thoughts. When we compare the results from long-term effects 1 with long-term effects 2, by incorporating these recommendations, what we see is that long-term effects 2 is generally slightly lower, tend to be lower multipliers, and they tend to be less extreme. So you can see the MASB brands on the top and the audience measurement 9, the ARF audience measurement 9 brands on the bottom. But so those are the brands that we had done both sets of studies for. So I'm going to share some validation work. The landmark study that most long-term effects are attributed to are really Len Lodish's 1991-1995 study. It's the same study reported in different ways in 1991 and 1995. And if you look at all of the results that you see in his study, he's looking at 2 to 3 years of extended effects over the first full year of advertising effects. So he's looking at the direct effects for 1 year, and then what is the effect of that advertising over the next 2 years. And so we actually used a methodology very similar to the Lotus methodology. We used matched households. We took all of our ANCOVA matched studies that we had available, where we had all the data available and enough data. So it had to be sort of studies that were done right at the right amount of time so that we'd have 2 years of post-period data, and we only have 2.25 years of data in our data set. So this is, of the 10 of the 15 studies really had 2 full years of post-data. And when we looked at that array of brands, we see a high of 10 and then a low of -1, with quite a few in the range around 2. What Lotus found was from -2 to a +9, with most of them being in the range of 2. So very similar sort of range of results, type of results from if we use this ANCOVA methodology to replicate Lotus. What we then did is we looked at this Lotus methodology, but instead of looking at a 1-year period as the short term, to turn it into 12 weeks. So if we said, what was 2 years, but we're dividing against the 12-week period. So we're looking at our short term being, instead of a full year, actually what we're measuring here, because it's kind of, we're trying to do some, cut the distance halfway. But, use our periods of time with his methodology. When we do that, we see same studies, the 10 studies, we look at them, we get an R-squared of 33 with a correlation of 0.5. And you can see that, some of the studies are higher, some are lower, but in general, what we're seeing is that we're probably measuring something that's similar. There aren't really enough data points, but it looks like we're in the same sort of ballpark. So what are our findings across those 31 studies? This is the range of studies. You'll get the slide so you can look at what each one of these. On the low end, we have a condiment, very rarely bought. It has a very long purchase cycle. This condiment actually had a very low sales effect, short-term effect of advertising. And on the right side, we have a carbonated soft drink, which has a very short purchase cycle, a lot of dollars every week. It had some of the highest short-term effects. So you have a sort of spectrum. You can see that most of the multipliers are between 1.5 and 2.5. And if we average this particular set of 31, we get an average multiplier of 2.04. So this sort of gives us roughly the kinds of data that we've got. I'm sorry. When we look at, for the MASB and AM9 brands, we had 2 years of data. We had done long-term effects 1, and now we had long-term effects 2. Kellogg's Special K, actually their advertising is right in the middle of the year. Like they advertise over Christmas break, so we couldn't use that campaign. But we could look at these 8, and we looked at the difference between the effects that we saw in 2013 and the effects we saw in 2014. And the assumption was that they'd all be roughly the same. I mean, we didn't know. Would it matter if it was, does the brand's long-term effects stay the same, or does it change with campaigns? And we see that mostly they're pretty similar, but there can be big differences. So in the case of soft drink B or toothpaste E, we see, a shift almost by 32%. Then we compared short-term multipliers versus long-term multipliers. So does it matter? And sure enough, the higher your short term, the higher your long term. So the R squared is 35. It's not perfect. But you can see on the left, we've got the condiment, very low short-term effect. We have that carbonated soft drink on the right, very high short-term effects, and you see the relationship. We then go to weekly dollars, the amount of money that's spent each week on the brand. So this is sort of thinking about if you're spending money and you're spending it regularly, does that drive a higher long term? And yeah, we see that it does. There's a 0.27. And again, carbonated on the right, that's a brand you spend a lot of money every week. Condiment on the left, you don't, and you can see what happens in the middle. We said, what about purchase cycle? So if we go back and say weekly dollars, how much of those, so weekly dollars is related to how much you spend, and it's related to how often you spend. Like, do you spend it every week? So I thought, well, let's look at purchase cycle. And we do see that there's a relationship, okay? It's a negative relationship, which makes sense because a long purchase cycle gives you, if you buy it more regularly, you have a short purchase cycle. So the condiment on the left has a very long purchase cycle. Soda on the right has a lower one. And we see, again, if we narrowed the band, it would spread out more and it looked like what it is, but it's a 0.14. So a piece of it's the money and a piece of it's the purchase cycle. But does everything drive long-term effect? We looked at GRPs. If you spend more money on advertising, do you get a higher long-term effect? And actually, it's at an R square of 0. I don't know if I've ever seen something with exactly 0, but this was 0. So the answer is most definitely no. And what that means is that the GRPs and how much weight you have completely drives your short term. So if your advertising is working and you spend more money, you drive the short term. That drives the actual sales. And once you've driven that sale, the creative, what kind of brand you are, everything else about what's happening in the advertising is what connects that consumer in the long term. It's not about GRPs. So that was interesting. So it's not the size of the ad. All of the size has to do with the short term, not the multiplier that goes to long. And that's important. And we wanted to say, well, is it all GRPs, or could it be share of voice? Like, we've got condiments and we've got carbonated soft drinks. They definitely have different kinds of total advertising spend in the category. But no, this is a 0.01 for an R squared, also, virtually 0. And no, the amount of money that's the share of voice. Some of these brands had 100% share of voice during the campaign period, and others had as low as 2 and 3%. And it didn't seem to make any difference in the long-term effect. So what's next? What else do we want to accomplish? We certainly want to think about new media. We'd like to, we want to extend this work into digital and mobile, across print and radio, all of our media platforms. And we really welcome anybody willing to go venture into those areas. This is, we think it's going to be very important to see how the other media drive long term. And we also want to build a norms database so that we can look at benchmarks and understand what drives the long-term effect. We want to understand that for food and beverage, for RX and over-the-counter, for health and beauty, for adult beverages, alcohol and beer, and then household products. So across all the kinds of products that we measure, we want to look at this. So thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Yes, thanks, Leslie. That's great. We've had a very good turnout for this webinar, and we do have a number of questions. One came up early in your presentation, and I believe you addressed it pretty explicitly later on, but let me just raise that again, and that is remind us about the definition of long and short term that you've been using, and apparently you adapted that in the course of the study a little bit.
Yeah, so the long term for this study is 52 weeks. It's 52 weeks because that's the data that we've got. We've got 2.25 years of data we maintain. And the first year has to be used to determine whether a household is a trier or a non-trier. So the first year sort of falls off the map. And then you've got a campaign period. And so we had thought, well, if some people used only a 6-month pre-period, then we could extend it longer. But in talking to these industry experts, they felt that it was pretty important that we fix the long term consistently across all studies, and we fix the short term. So we felt we could only fix it at a year. For some studies, we could do a year and a quarter, but for the vast majority, it's going to be a year. So the long term is 52 weeks, and the short term is 12 weeks. That's the longest that we see any effect. If we extend the measure out any longer, it begins to just have noise and not actually be measuring the effect of advertising. We are talking about perhaps saving more data, but that's a lobbying event on my side to have bigger computers and more storage space.
Okay, great. Kind of think a related question, and that is someone was asking, does the long-term effect, the depth of repeat, for example, depend on future advertising, and how do you control for that? And the follow-on question to that was, how do you look at long-term effect for brands that are on the air continuously for 52 weeks? That would be sort of hard. You don't have the pulsing on and off that you described for most of your products.
Right. So we didn't have any products that were on all the time. We did have products that were on half of the year in that 31. We are not controlling for the advertising that happens in the future. And if you go back and read all the literature, no one else has either. So none of the other bodies of work that have been done control for advertising into the future, quote-unquote, future period. The comment in Len Lotus's study is assuming comparable levels of marketing activity. It's really we can't control for any of the marketing variables, and we know that what we're doing is we're saying this is what we observed in the past, but what we're observing was influenced by the changes that were made to all the brands in the category, and in the future they will be too. So it's as close an estimate as we can get, and in part that's because the complexity that happens. So I'm looking at it in a given week, and I'm saying I'm now going to look 52 weeks into the future. So every purchase, we're then looking at that purchase, what happens for the next year. And when we look at that, some of those purchases will have been further affected in week 7, 9, 27, and 42, and the next purchase might be affected in week 2, 23, 85. You know, it could be any influences can happen, and they become far too complex to begin to model and control for. So what we do a very good job of controlling for the influences to measure the short term, and then we're looking at what kind of multiplier there is.
Right, and on that topic, again, there's I think a question about sort of clarifying what you mean by the long-term multiplier. One of the questions said, is this similar to the carryover concept, which was essentially a half-life concept that has been used traditionally in thinking about the impact of advertising? Are you using long-term effect?
I'm not. So when we think of decay or ad stock or carryover, that's more of a diminishing effect, direct effect of advertising on sales. So when you think about the direct effect, you're measuring, did that advertising change the purchasing that household made that day? And that's a direct effect in ad stock or decays or half-lives, and those are pieces that measure that. And in general, what we see is that the direct effects of advertising are diminished or disappear within 12 to 13 weeks. Some often within 4 weeks. I mean, it depends on the advertising and the quality and messaging, et cetera, and what else is happening in the market. But when we think of long-term, what we're really thinking about is the connectedness of that. How is that commercial connected the consumer to the brand? I watched a recent MSI webinar on the effects of advertising, and I can't remember his name, but he talked about Nike and black T-shirts, and they gave T-shirts to half the people with a Nike symbol and half the people without the Nike symbol. And the people with the Nike symbol exercised longer and harder and felt more virtuous. And they were the same T-shirts, just a logo. So that's what advertising is trying to do, is connect you to so that it matters, that logo matters. It makes you feel like exercise. It makes you exercise longer. It connects you to the brand, and the brand becomes part of you. What we see in short term is that it's directly changed what you bought this time. But what we're looking for in long term is that equity. We're looking at the quality of your repeat purchases. Are you repeating more and more? And the more repeat purchases you make, the more you buy consecutively. We tried many, many measures, and consecutive purchases was the one that really stood out. When you look at consecutive purchases, what you see is that it's a very good discriminator in how much money a household will spend for the next year. So that's what we were measuring, is more of that. Did the connection to the consumer, and I think that's why if you have short-term effects, you get long-term effects, because the short-term effect is a measure of how well did you connect to the consumer, and if you connected well, you'll see that in the long term.
Thanks, Leslie. And there's a question that came in just a moment ago that I think is related to your last point there, and that is, and you wouldn't have had the data in this particular study perhaps, but maybe speculate about this. The question is, have you done the analyses looking at segments defined by loyalty groups, behavioral segments that reflect loyalty? You were just commenting that the frequency of purchase and repeat purchase in a household, you can infer perhaps loyalty in that situation, and that's where you do see some of your stronger multiplier effects. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so there's many different ways to measure loyalty. And that's what we set out to do in Long-Term Effects 1, in the Phase 1 part of this work. We took 12 or 13 different ways of looking at loyalty, and we applied them all. We said, what percentage of the dollars did you spend in the last 3 months, 6 months, 3 purchase occasions, 6 purchase occasions, what percent of units, how many occasions. We tried all different kinds of ways of thinking about trial and depth of repeat. Trial is easy. If you haven't bought the brand and then you buy it, bingo. But it's that group of households that are your current consumers. How do you distinguish among this mass of consumers their level of loyalty at a household level? Because this is single source, and you want to be able to go look at a household and say, this household is this connected to a brand, and have it make a difference. And so that trial and depth of repeat was the measure that we found produced the highest differences in the long term, the amount of money that those households spent in the future year.
Thanks. You showed a slide some time ago about the different multipliers across different product categories. And you said that slide will be available if people want to download and look at that in more detail. But do you have any sort of generalizations? That's maybe one more.
Yes.
In any sort of general patterns about where the multipliers appear to be greater, any speculation, any theory about why that might be so? We went through,
I shared several things that I felt drove higher response. So we see certainly the short-term effect. The higher your short-term, the higher your long-term.
Right.
We saw that the more dollars that were spent on the brand every week, the more that the higher your sales were. So we thought some of that could be purchase cycle, because if you're spending a lot of money, is it because you're reminded because you buy it every week? And something about, if condiments are bought twice a year, 6 months later, do you remember what you bought last time? Is that as strongly embedded as a soft drink that you're buying every day?
Right.
So we thought purchase cycle would actually be part of that. But it's only about half of the R squared. So there's, it's only explaining half of it. So I would say that there's a piece that dollars, so the more expensive it is, the more important it is to you. And if you do it more often, purchase cycle, that influences it as well. I think creative has a huge effect. I think that's what we're seeing when we look at the same brand year over year. That the marketing variables and the marketing messaging that's being used will have a big influence.
That's actually a great transition into the next question. You mentioned towards the end of your presentation that the sheer weight, the GRPs, don't seem to have that much impact on the multiplier effect, and it presumably is creative and other factors that affect that. So could you maybe just revisit that and say again what you were trying to share there? I think people found that very interesting and maybe even a little controversial, but
it is a little controversial. But I want to make sure. So I'm going back to that slide because it is important. It isn't that we're saying that the amount of GRPs don't matter. We're saying that they don't change your multiplier. What they change is, so when we look at short-term effects, excuse me, when we're looking at the short-term effects, those are being driven by the amount of money each brand is spending and the number of households that are reached. So if you reach only a small number of households, you can only change behavior among a very small number of households. Advertising will not change households that are not reached. Sort of a, advertising 101. You have to deliver your message in order for that message to affect a change. But once it has to affect a change in order for the long term to carry out. So it really is about, did that short-term effect change your behavior? And if it did, then you see that carried over into the long term. It's not the amount of money that you spent, and it's not the number of GRPs.
Great. I think that helps clarify a very important point. I think it might have been a follow-up question to that. And is there in this data or maybe in future studies a way to sort of tease out the impact of the creative? You can assume now, I guess, that it's sort of, randomly distributed across the examples you have, some better than others. But is there any way to actually control for the impact of the creative itself?
Well, creative is definitely going to be in the short term. No question. Okay? So creative drives short term. And we know from quite a bit of work that has been done that it's about, the work that I've done, it's about 65% of the effect of advertising is due to creative. About 15% is media and the tactical piece. But looking at this year over year, when you look at the year over year effects, you can see that something is changing. This is the same brand in the same category, so it's probably the creative and it's probably all the marketing variables that are going into what's happening in that year. In the future, the way we measure creative is by using sales effect, our short-term sales effect. We can break out creative, and we could look at when we see very high creative effects, do they carry over? Do they have a longer multiplier? I would assume yes, because the higher the short-term, the higher the long-term.
And speaking of future efforts, then you did allude to that at the end, that this was based on TV. We need to include other media. Do you have even sort of an educated guess, a hunch about the appropriate timeline to measure other non-TV media? You know,
Timeline
TV,
in terms of how soon we do it?
well, I guess that's one way. No, I was thinking more in terms of, you know, looking, as you said, the long term is 52 weeks. That sort of corresponds to, you know, the notion of TV, you know, like programs on TV that might run the course of a year or something like that. There was one question, I think, related to this, too, about suggestions for social media advertising. That's going to obviously be a very different phenomenon and different timelines. It's
but I think that what we're measuring here is not, the timelines are not really, the 12 weeks are related to TV, but we see that same 12 weeks in other media. I haven't seen a longer, so I think the 12 weeks is really, this is my personal belief, I think the 12 weeks is related to being a human being. That you just don't remember what happened more than 12 weeks ago as a particular event. It's kind of like gets, you know, it becomes a part of your existence. It doesn't stand out. Now, that's not to say that we all can't remember a jingle from 20 years ago, you know, from when we were a kid. I mean, everybody's got a jingle that they could remember from when they were a kid. But if you think of all the jingles you've heard in your life, one or two is a very small percentage of what you've heard. I think that in terms of when we go look at a brand, I suspect rather than it changing by media, that it would change a lot more by different verticals. So we're CPG. I believe that it's going to be different in different verticals. I think if you're talking about buying a car, I think it's going to be, you know, I'm not sure that we see advertising of cars the same way if we're not in the market for a car.
Right.
I think when you're in the market, when you're thinking you're going to buy a car, you're noticing the advertising in a very, very different way. But you know, clearly, you know, our feelings about brands, some being extremely expensive or very cheap, are related to what the advertising is, even if we've never bought them.
Right. Well, you know, the classic use of that kind of advertising is just to be in the consideration set when you are in the market for a given product.
Right.
It comes to mind, you know, you'll at least check it out, perhaps. There was a question that came in just now. I think it's something you touched on earlier, but maybe again to clarify. The analysis was based on households. Were these people that we know were exposed to the ads, or was it all? Okay.
Yeah. So I did not go into what it takes to be in what NCS does and what it takes to be in this data set, because the program's already long enough. But fundamentally, NCS our core backbone is an ID for every household in the country. And to that backbone, we add a small data set and a large data set for every one of the pieces of data. So we have frequent shopper data for 70 million households. That's roughly half the households in the country. So we have big data for buying. We also have currency data because we have home scan. So we put together big data and small data to make smart data. I think you need to have a currency in order to understand big data. That's a whole webinar of its own. But we have that for purchasing. We have that for television in set-top box data and Nielsen People Meter and metered markets. We have it in digital world with all of our partners, as well as Nielsen Online and tagged media. We have a mobile panel. We have radio. Radio is the only panel that we only have currency for because I don't have a big data set for over-the-air. We do have radio through Pandora kind of radio through digital, but over-the-air radio, I don't have a source for big data. And for print, we only have big data because we have the subscription. Love to have MRI in, and that's just a matter of the publishers being willing to support that. But our goal is each one of these, we know household by household, exposure to the media across time, and purchasing of the brands and categories across time. And we know for purchasing, we know within 3 days. what everybody purchased, and advertising, we know, depending on the kind of advertising, within a week, what was on air, or what advertising was delivered through digital or mobile or radio. Radio takes a little longer because you've got to get the monitoring piece, but we were able to track actual exposure. It's not estimated. It's actual exposure and actual purchase.
That's great. One last question, and I'll take my prerogative as the moderator to ask this. As I mentioned in the introduction, your involvement in the past was really helping to spearhead Project Apollo, the first attempt to kind of get an industry-wide 360 view of the consumer, the media exposure, the subsequent marketing activity, and so forth. What are your thoughts today about why we may be approaching that nirvana, of having this integrated look at the customer, and maybe what was not available to us or what didn't work a few years back when this was attempted with Apollo? That might be a way of kind of pointing where you see the future going as well.
Okay, so, actually, the first set of data I used, I'm the only person who's worked with every single source data set that's ever existed in the U.S. And each one of them, over the years, they've appeared and then disappeared within a year or two because it has been way too expensive. And in the early years, there actually wasn't the computing power to be able to look at this data. So in the first real set of single source was Colin McDonald in 1965 with 200 housewives writing down what they bought and what they saw on TV. So we've progressed beyond there, certainly. But the computing power you need to handle large data sets and transactional data sets it has finally caught up. The analytics that you need, because this isn't simple. I started a long time ago. The things I did in the beginning were quite simple, but we've learned that you need to, we've learned from market mix the kinds of things that you need to take into account. We know that what happens in the store can change people's behavior. We know that features and display, we know the price of items. We know that, we've learned an awful lot from all the other measurement techniques. But the biggest difference between Apollo and what we have today is that Apollo was a paid panel. Apollo, the consumers were being paid to collect all that information. And what we have now is truly passive and truly serendipitous. It's the frequent shopper data that you're using your card for other reasons. It's the set-top box. You're using it for other reasons. And we're taking that data and we're spinning it into gold, so to speak. But it does take work. It does take work because big data sounds wonderful, but it really isn't census-level data, and it does have biases, and it does have pieces that are not balanced, and you have to make sure that you're really capturing the changes that are happening, not among some select group, but really that can be projected to what's happening against the whole population.
Well, thanks very much, Leslie. I think that's a great way to wrap up a very interesting and engaging webinar. Thanks again for taking the time to be with us, and thanks to our MSI audience. We did have quite a few questions, and I apologize if we weren't able to get to all of them, but I'm sure if you're interested, that Leslie would love to hear from you and follow up. We'll display the very end of the presentation here. I think we have a contact information.
Oh,
right.
Sorry.
The email address,
I
Twitter handle, and right. So, again, please follow up with Leslie if you have more specific questions that we couldn't get to. We want to thank you again, Leslie, and the audience for being here. This, again, is part of a continuing series of webinars. I will mention parenthetically that the example that Leslie cited earlier, the Nike example in a previous webinar, was a webinar with Peter Boatwright. So if you go to the MSI website, find the videos, you'll see the archived versions of webinars, and you can scroll back to the Peter Boatwright webinar where that Nike example, among many others, was used. Very convergent with some of Leslie's points that she was making. So again,
Earl, thank you for so much for hosting us. We really, really appreciate it. And actually, we more than that, thank you to MSI for all the amazing work you do, because championing this space between academia and business is really critical.
Well, thanks so much.
Very much appreciated.
That's what we strive to do, and we appreciate your help. So again, be watching for future announcements about future webinars that will be posted on our website, and those of you who signed up with us will receive occasional emails to update you. And again, if you have any questions about MSI or our events or activities, just be in touch with one of us through our website, and we'll get back to you. So again, thanks to all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.